These jokers can't even keep the lights on, or the heat on, or the water running when the temperature drops in Texas. Now they want to take over our elections? Are you going to let them? No, me neither. They're trying to stop more people from voting in a state that is already the toughest in America in which to vote. And what happens? Look, it's not an abstract thing. What happens when you can't vote? You have no say over the quality of your kid's school. You have no say over who represents you on the city council. You have no say about affordable housing in your community. You have no say about justice, especially racial justice in this country. I would ask you to call your senator. But between inciting insurrection and taking off to the Ritz-Carlton in Cancun when the temperature drops, he's got his plate full. So this is what I want you to do. We've got a president in the White House who cares about us, every one of us, Republican, Democrat, Independent, wants to make sure that the voting rights in this country are respected. He needs to hear from you. And we tell him, Mr. President, we're doing our part. And we have lots of hope. But right now, we need some help. You need to use all of the political capital you have to push through the For the People Act. It is the 1965 Voting Rights Act of our day. I need you to call him.
Well, that was, Katie, are you going to tell about that video we just saw?
Well, it was a YouTube video that featured Beto speaking, and I'm not going to say anything about it because I didn't just watch it.
Well, we're gonna address a lot of voter suppression, but I wanted to start off initially, Beto. We wanted to talk about the border before the rash of voter suppression laws swept the country. So what we wanted to hear from you a little bit about what's going on in the border. What are the routes? Has it improved? Any solutions that you see on the horizon?
Well, as you both know very well, there are a lot of people fleeing some significant misery, especially in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, traveling more than 2,000 miles to seek refuge and asylum and safety here in our country. The previous administration made it extraordinarily hard for them to do it. And in fact, many, myself included, would argue broke US law in keeping them from legitimate asylum application requests. And really they were in these detention camps in cities like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana and other Mexican border communities. That situation in the first few months of the Biden administration has improved significantly. The Biden administration is trying to ensure that we follow US law when it comes to a side job at reducing the number of days and even hours that children and families are kept in Border Patrol detention. And as you know, they're beginning to reunite the thousands of families that were separated under President Trump's cruel zero tolerance family separation policy. So we see some positive steps in the right direction. It is not fast enough and it's not big enough in terms of the change that we need to see to US policy. So we want to encourage the Biden administration to do more, reunite more of these families, do a better job of following our asylum laws. And then, as you just suggested, Michael, get to the underlying causes that would force someone to flee this great distance. You know, the violence, the level of poverty, the effects of climate change, and the US-sponsored civil wars and drug wars that have really ravaged and hollowed out so much of Latin America, especially Central America. These are the things that we've got.
There's a lot of talk in the news about jobs going unfilled, and someone in El Paso told me that there are signs everywhere along Mesa, et cetera, of people looking for people to fill positions. And could there a case be made in Congress to increase work visas, to let more people in, to train, to fill these jobs like many generations of earlier migrants have done?
You know, the first step that I'd love to see, Michael, is that we ask businesses to pay a higher wage.
Right on.
The minimum in El Paso is $7.25 an hour, which means that you probably got to work 2, and in some cases, depending on how big your family is, 3 jobs at a minimum wage in order to make ends meet. So that's certainly not a situation that's working for the people of El Paso or Texas or throughout most of the country. But to the spirit of your question, yes, we saw the lowest population growth in the United States over a 10-year period since 1790. We are in desperate need of more talent, more people, and those who can come to this country and make us better by their very presence. So I hope part of what President Biden does is really push a comprehensive immigration bill through Congress. That is a priority for this country.
So that's great to know, and we couldn't agree more about the need for a more comprehensive immigration improvement
And higher wages.
reform, and of course the higher wages. Both Michael and I have been to those areas and seen what the U.S. government was doing in the 80s in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. And so we're right there with you. The next thing that we see, and we're very, very concerned about, is voting rights and fighting voter suppression. The big lie is still being given as the excuse for suppressive voting laws. What just happened this week in Texas? Did they pass something horrendous that we heard about?
They did last Friday in the dead of night, literally at 3 a.m. in the morning. They passed a set of voter suppression provisions that would make it much harder for people to vote in Texas. And Katie, this is already the toughest state in the nation in which to register to vote and in which to cast a ballot. It's 50th out of 50 in ease of voting. And those voter suppression tactics historically have been targeted at Black voters, at Mexican-American voters, voters with disabilities, young voters, old voters, and voters in big cities. And it's no surprise that these current voter suppression bills target these same set of voters. It does away with 24-hour voting, which is really hard on shift workers. Again, you're working two $7.25 an hour jobs. That second shift may get off at 2 a.m. Your next shift may start at 8 a.m. If you don't have 24-hour voting, you're not voting at all. It does away with curbside voting, which would be very hard for those with disabilities. It requires those with disabilities to disclose what their disability is in a public setting. So personal, private, privileged information being released to the public. And then perhaps one of the most pernicious elements of this, it allows so-called poll watchers who historically have been posted at polls to keep Black voters and lower income voters from freely being able to vote. It allows them free reign in the polling places, including allowing them to videotape voters as they try to cast their ballots. We know that is likely to dissuade really an untold number of voters and voters targeted within certain demographics that Republicans and frankly, the white men in power in Texas fear the most. So the answer to this is to ensure that we mobilize in Texas to stop these before final passage and before they're signed into law by our Governor Greg Abbott. And then maybe just as importantly, to appeal to our US senators and to the president to pass the For the People Act, which would roll back these voter suppression efforts in states like Georgia and Texas and Florida and expand voting rights throughout the country. That's the way that we meet this challenge with action.
So I'm going to follow up on that, just one thing, because different parts of the country have different orientations. For example, you just mentioned poll watchers. The way that we beat the daily machine in Chicago was poll watching. We were the first ones that went into polling places and turned to the back of the machine with the judges and said, I want to see that no votes have been cast, So that was our defense. So what you're describing is a situation where the Republicans, who clearly don't want anybody to vote because they can't win, that seems to be what's going on. They are the ones recruiting poll watchers. Why do we not have poll watchers on both sides is one question.
It's really interesting that you bring up the difference between how poll watching has been conducted in Illinois and then how poll watching has been conducted in Kansas. I mean, in Texas and frankly in Kansas and in other states that are
Right.
facing voter suppression
Right.
measures. In Texas, this sordid history of poll watching goes all the way back to the Ku Klux Klan, who would post their members at various polling locations. It's connected to the poll tax and the enforcement of the literacy test around voting, all provisions intended to keep Black voters from participating in our politics. What you see in Texas today with this very onerous voter ID system, a number of, in fact, 750 polling place closures over the last 8 years, and a racial gerrymander of our state, not my words, but the words of a 3-judge federal panel, is you see Jim Crow dressed up in 21st century clothing. And this idea that we are simply standardizing elections in Texas and that all of these provisions apply equally to Black and white voters alike, when we know the outcome and the effect is certainly targeted at Black voters and other voters of color. What makes it so hard, Katie, is that the 1965 Voting Rights Act was gutted in the 2013 Supreme Court Shelby decision. So there's no pre-clearance provision. So the Department of Justice can't review all these awful things that Texas and Georgia and Florida and other southern and western states are doing in Arizona. And it's really, if we don't pass the For the People Act, it'll take us years under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to bring these issues to court and adjudicate them successfully. We need action now.
So one of the things that we've been saying on this show in regards to that, because we also cover historic stuff, is that we need an anti-war size movement really across the country, banging on voters' rights and pushing to pass the bill that's making its way through Congress right now.
For the people.
Yeah, when you started something called Powered by People, is that the right name I've got?
That's right.
And so we're talking community organizing, aren't we?
Absolutely. Our volunteers are going door to door to register voters in Texas. So even if these bills pass and become law, these voter suppression bills, we can still win. It's just going to be a lot harder, and we have to start working a lot earlier. And we can't do it at a distance. We can't literally phone it in. We've got to be at people's doors, having conversations now in 2021. If we have any hope of winning in 2022 or 2024. So Powered by People is comprised of literally tens of thousands of volunteers, primarily in Texas, but we also have them in Illinois and Chicago and really everywhere else in this country, all of whom are focused on restoring and strengthening our democracy and ensuring that in states like Texas, there's a level enough playing field so that Democrats can compete and win statewide elections. And so I'm really proud of the voter registration work our volunteers have done, but they've also done a lot of humanitarian work after we had a really bad winter storm and power outage where nearly 200 Texans died, many of hypothermia and carbon monoxide inhalation. Our volunteers were on the phones and on the doors, bringing water and food and transportation and connecting people to warming centers so that they could literally survive. And we've done something very similar around COVID vaccines in the poorest, hardest hit zip codes in the state, knocking on doors, signing people up for a vaccine, making sure that in a state that's lost 50,000 people already, that we don't lose any more needlessly. And so a lot of great community-based organizing in Texas right now.
You know, let me follow that up, Beto. I've been coming down there for basketball in the barrio for about 20 something years. And there was always talk about Texas turning blue from people I met. And I know there were a lot of hopes for this recent election. And I'm sure that some gains were made, but we had no significant victories. And one of the talking points that came out of it was how in the Valley, the Latino vote did not go for the Democrats as much as was expected. And it occurred to, while Katie and I were talking, that a lot of, there's a conservative strain in the Latino community and always been a number of kind of Republicans. What do we do going forward? Do we try to change those people's minds, or do we get more results does a larger opportunity exist if we register new voters and do a lot more, basic organizing to turn out the vote on all sectors?
Overall, Latinos overwhelmingly favored Biden-Harris in 2020 throughout the country, including in Texas. But I think the way that you phrased the question is accurate. They did not vote for Biden at the levels that many expected them to. And I think what we're coming to realize as we pore over the voter data from 2020 is that it wasn't so much that Latino voters in El Paso and Laredo and McAllen and Brownsville switched their votes from 2016 to 2020, from Democrats to Republicans, but that new Latino voters who had not voted in 2016 were compelled to come out for perhaps the first time in their lives. And I think there were a number of extraordinary circumstances, including the deadliest pandemic of our lifetimes, the worst recession since the Great Depression, and a host of other unique challenges, especially along the border, that might have precipitated that outcome and that turnout that we saw. You also had this, Michael. Democrats were not on the ground knocking on doors and meeting voters where they were. Republicans were. Republicans did do that hard work. And we can debate whether that was the appropriate thing to do given the public health guidance at the time prior to the vaccine. But nonetheless, when we take our entire army off the field, it shouldn't surprise us when the other army does better than they did the last time around. So I think lesson for all of us, and myself included, is we cannot ever cede the field, and we've got to contest every single door. And so I have been traveling to border communities like Laredo, which is about a 10-hour drive from my home in El Paso, to go knock on doors and meet voters and listen to them and understand what's most important to them. And they need to be hearing a really compelling, simple economic message around wages. We keep coming back to $7.25 an hour. That just doesn't work for anyone. Or healthcare. We're the least insured state in the country. That region, the Mexican border counties in Texas, the Texas counties that border Mexico, are the least insured within the least insured state, which means, Michael and Katie, that people routinely die of diabetes. They die of the flu. They die of curable cancers. And of course, they've been dying from COVID at record rates. So talking about just making sure that you can see a doctor and fill a prescription and take your child to a therapist, making sure that you don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. These are the kinds of things that we need to be saying at people's doors, but we can't put it on TV or on a billboard or put it in the mail or say it on Facebook and hope that people are watching. We've got to show up and pay the respect due to those who will decide the outcome of the next election. Speaking of the next election,
You've now had experience in 2 big elections where we all got to know you better. When you ran in Texas, and because you are who you are, and the race was what it was, a lot of us got to know you, and in fact supported you from very far away. You ran for president. What did you learn running for president about who's in charge, who gets covered? Why do Dems fight one another in ridiculous ways? I have stories from 2016 when I was a Bernie delegate, and then I came home and worked for Hillary. And I'm telling you, I could tell you things about that presidential campaign that made it obvious why we didn't win. So any reaction to electoral politics? A lot of us, work in it as volunteers. We feel we are the Democratic Party's foot soldiers, but we also get frustrated by what. Yeah. So
I think I share a lot of your frustration, and I think a lot of people do, not just Democrats, but Americans. The role that, for example, Iowa plays in selecting our nominee, an overwhelmingly white state with a lot of great people in it, but not necessarily most representative of who our country is. I mean, come to Texas, come to Houston, for example, which is the most diverse city in America, bar none. You'll find the largest Vietnamese language speaking population outside of Vietnam in Houston. They speak 120 different languages in the school system in Houston. As Michael knows from his visits to El Paso, the city I'm in is 85% Mexican American. It's a beautiful blending of two cultures and two nationalities and two languages. You're not going to see a whole hell of a lot of that in Iowa or in New Hampshire. So having a process by which we allow the extraordinarily diverse electorate of the Democratic Party and the extraordinary diverse population of the United States to determine who should represent us as our candidate across this country. I think that would be extraordinarily helpful, and to make it a true contest of ideas and vision and platforms and policies, as well as personality. You're never going to get away from personality. I think that could really improve the process. But I'll tell you this, I have been so pleasantly surprised by President Biden's performance so far. I mean, I don't know that I would have been in the primary race for president if I thought Biden was going to be as great a president as he has been. I would have sat back and gotten behind him or gotten behind Bernie or gotten behind somebody else. But I think he surprised so many of us with how steadfastly progressive he has been, how he's really turned the attention away from himself and the presidency, where Donald Trump had it, and really focused on the rest of the country, and has brought much needed relief and aid to those who are really, really struggling. And so I am cautiously optimistic about what he will do next when it comes to climate and infrastructure, democracy, immigration. I like what he did on the minimum wage for federal contractors, and I hope he uses all the muscle he's got to raise that wage for everyone else working throughout this country. So I certainly see room for a tremendous amount of improvement in how we select our nominee, but I am really grateful for how our nominee performed in the general election and what he's done thus far as president.
So besides running this Powered by People, I hear you're teaching in college. What else do you do to keep yourself busy?
I'm so lucky. I'm teaching a class at Texas State, an undergraduate course on Texas politics. And then I'm teaching a graduate course at the University of Texas LBJ School that's on voting rights and the history of voting rights in America, which is a fascinating story, and the history of voting rights in Texas, which is also fascinating and terribly sad and uplifting alternately, depending on what year or decade you're looking at. But it's interesting that having spent the semester focused on that, that's effectively the most important, or essentially the most important issue developing in this country right now. What passed in Florida, what passed in Georgia, what recently passed and could be signed into law in Texas, and what is pending in 44 other state legislatures right now, on top of the insurrection on the 6th of January, the big lie that you mentioned at the top of the show. I mean, if you care about democracy, this is the most essential time for you to be alive and in the fight. So I learned a lot in that class from my students. I hope I was able to share a lot, and now we're all working on this stuff in real day-to-day life.
Maybe you could whip up a quick book on voter rights that could go countrywide and help us do what we need to do in the next year and a half before the midterms even.
I'd love to be able to do that.
Speaking of voter rights, I saw you on the Nicole Wallace show the other day, and you definitely dodged questions about your future, saying that wherever you're needed most, either on the ground or in running for office. But you did stress the importance that the biggest priority is voting rights and the fear of losing democracy. And you really called on people to put pressure on the president and other elected officials. Do you want to expand upon that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, a lot of people are referring to this moment as Jim Crow 2.0, and one might be forgiven for asking, well, what the hell does that mean? And what was Jim Crow 1.0? And we know that from the end of Reconstruction, so the last flourishing of multiracial democracy, until 1965, African Americans in the South and frankly through much of the country were denied full citizenship, full civil rights, and the ability to participate in our democracy. And it took John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks and so many civil rights heroes, many of whom gave their lives as martyrs to the cause to compel this country by forcing our conscience to do the right thing. And that resulted in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. There is no way that Lyndon Baines Johnson would have used his limited political capital in the first years of his presidency to push through these controversial bills if he was not forced to do so by those who took action and applied the pressure that produced the political will to get the job done at the end of the day. That's what we need right now, because we have a similar attack on multiracial democracy, rolling back the hard-fought wins and gains secured in the 65 Voting Rights Act. And Shelby did it, the voter suppression measures, the insurrection, the big lie. I mean, this is it. And so all of us must step up right now and speak out and compel the president, who I think is a good man and believes in this issue and wants to do the right thing. But I think in some instances, we've got to force the president to do that. And I heard an apocryphal story about FDR meeting with the NAACP, who outlined a litany of complaints about how African Americans were treated in this country. And according to this apocryphal story, FDR said to the NAACP representatives, "I know you're right. Now make me do something about pressure and public sentiment to bear so that I have no other choice but to do the right thing." I think we're in that kind of a moment with President Biden. He knows we're right. Now we've got to make him do it. And so that one is on all of us. We can't just blame our members of Congress or castigate the Republican Party. We have to look at ourselves and decide what we are willing to do.
Boy, you said it best. And one thing reminding people on this show is that the 50 senators who caucus with the Democrats represent about 41.5 million more Americans than the 50 Republican senators represent. And if we could get that straightened out before the next presidential, we might have a chance of, a different outcome of
Amen.
Electoral College.
Beto, we really want to thank you for joining us. We know you're a busy guy these days. And I do want to share an opportunity for you. I just got a text from our mutual friend, Steve Yellen. He and Russ Bradford have been running basketball in the barrio for years. And Steve wants to know if you will come to camp, which will be virtual this year, and do a speech, a song, or a poem to kick it off. And if your son Ulysses, who he says is really a hotshot dribbler, will do some Zoom instruction for other kids in the Segundo Barrio.
I'll do anything for Steve and Russ and for you all, and especially for basketball in the barrio. And I want to thank you, Michael, for supporting that program. For your listeners and viewers who don't know, 79901 is one of, if not the poorest zip code in the state of Texas, measured by median household income. These extraordinary people put on a very low cost camp, maybe $1 is the admission fee. And you get a wealth not just of basketball training and education, but you hear from musicians and poets and activists and civil rights champions. And it's one of the most beautiful things happening anywhere in the country. And it makes me so happy and proud that it takes place in El Paso. So absolutely, I will be there. And thank you for passing along the invitation.
Well, we want to thank you. And if you ever do run for office, we'll help you out any way we can, or whatever you're doing. You're a hell of a guy. And I look forward to seeing El Paso and watching you in the news.
Let
me know when you're in town.
Thank you so much for your service, Beto. Keep strong.
Power to the people.
Both of you as well. Adios.
Adios.
Adios. Nos vemos.
Nos vemos. Bye-bye.
Wonderful seasons are used and past. Wonderful seasons are over at last. And now you must die, child. Make it a gracious goodbye, child. Mother, deliver me, mother, deliver me, mother, deliver me now. Mother, deliver me now. Count counting beats for the soldiers to go. I lost track in the powerful snow. Oh, when should we go? I'm afraid I don't know. Father, deliver me, Father, deliver me, Father, deliver me.